Well, it's time for another board recap podcast. How are you today, Dr. Smith?
Great day. It's the second day of school as we're recording.
Yes. Happy beginning of the school year to you and yours.
Thank you. Very successful beginning.
Yeah, it is. And I know you've been to a lot of the
20.
schools, 20.
Yeah.
So you've been to half of our schools here over the first 2 days of the soft start with the first half of the alphabet. And it really does seem like, no surprise, because our schools work incredibly hard preparing, but things really do seem to be going well.
I think that is a great assessment. You're always going to have some things that happen every once in a while, but I think we're able to respond and correct those when and if they do happen. So
Good to see all those smiling faces
bet.
coming back.
it's been a very, very good start.
Right. And for this podcast, we have a special guest. He's been with us before, Dr. Carl Underwood, Assistant Superintendent of Human Resources and Business. Thank you for joining us today.
Excited to be here. Thank you.
All right. So we're going to get to you in just a bit because you had some very interesting information to share last night with our budget for our trustees. So before we get to that, though, we'll jump in with good news from last night. Started again talking about the first day of school. If you're actually watching this rather than listening to it, you're seeing some of those pictures with smiling faces of students. And it was, again, good to see those folks coming back. And we'll welcome the second half of the alphabet coming back then tomorrow and on Thursday before everyone is back on Friday. Next item of good news, we just lifted our new teacher orientation that we had a couple of weeks ago for all of our new teachers. And we say new teacher orientation, Dr. Smith, but you pointed this out. Kind of a combination, really, of new to teaching and some veteran folks that are joining EVSC in our team.
That's right. Great mix. Excited to see what I would call a lot of veteran teachers as well as with newer teachers. And we actually had several teachers that came back to EVSC.
Yes, definitely.
So I think that speaks well for our teaching staff. I think it speaks well for what EVSC provides. And I'm excited for our students to be able to work with our very, very outstanding teachers.
Yeah, we know they're going to make a big difference to those kids and their families. And then last thing from good news from last night, we talked about the Toyota Driving Possibilities Grant through the Toyota USA Foundation. And several of us were up at Toyota in Gibson County for the announcement of one of their new vehicles, but also then talking about this grant and $5.8 million for Lodge. That is amazing.
It's a game changer. And when you think about Lodge also being in the promised neighborhood, we will be able to leverage more support than I have ever seen one school have in a lifetime.
Right. And Lodge Community School is a K-8 school that feeds into Bosse High School. And yeah, really looking forward to that. And I know there's been a lot of groundwork laid. This work has been going on for some time. But boy, thank you to Toyota's Foundation for that.
You bet. We've been talking to the Toyota Foundation since before the pandemic. And what was unique about this experience, because we've worked on this specific grant for just about a year, Toyota didn't come to us and say, this is what we want you to do, boom, boom, and boom. They came to us and said, what do you need? Clearly, Toyota has a big investment at Bosse with the 4T program, and that is a very, very successful program.
Yes.
But Toyota, to its credit, also wants all students to be able to access STEM careers as well as STEM curriculum. And that begins at a very early age. So quite an investment in the Lodge community and the Bosse High School Attendance District, and we are excited to see that work begin.
Yeah, most definitely looking forward to, and we'll do some updates as time goes on and we see what things get put in place there. So that takes us through good news, and if you will, Dr. Smith, take us into consent items.
You bet. So let's start with consent item 3.02, consideration allowance of payments. That totals $7,915,627.95, and a very typical allowance of payments when you consider just one payroll, no health insurance taken this time, and I think $2.1 million in invoices. Consent item 3.03, consideration to approve the agreement with TNTP. So this is an ongoing scope of work with TNTP. They did great work with us last year, helped us select math curriculum, world-class math curriculum, and then they're going to continue now to provide ongoing implementation support so that we can use that curriculum to the optimal advantage for our students. They really are great at reaching out to your teachers, getting feedback from teachers, and then taking that feedback and then working with our teachers through coaching, through our PLC model, to make certain that they fully implement that new outstanding curriculum. And the source of funding for that is our ESSER $3. And then moving on to item 3.04, consideration to approve the renewal with instruction partners. I was just speaking to some folks this morning about how valued instruction partners is with EVSC. So this is also a continuation of work that Instruction Partner did in our schools last year. This, though, is the first tangible evidence of the Driving Possibility Grant with Toyota, because Toyota is picking up this nearly $84,000 expense to have Instruction Partner work specifically with the staff at Lodge. So,
And it's really about supporting those teachers. This isn't something that is being forced on them. This is a help
right.
to make their job easier as a
bet.
teacher. So, and as you said, second year. So, I mean, this is something that's continuing on.
Then item 3.05, consideration to approve the adult meal prices for the 23-24 school year. We're required annually to do a review of the prices that we charge for adults. So based upon that review, the adult lunch will remain the same price as $4.85 as it was last year, and the adult breakfast is going to see a slight increase from $2.70 last year, going up to $2.75 for this school year.
Okay, and then that takes us into consideration of personnel recommendations.
And as I say at this time, those personnel recommendations are there for the public's perusal. You simply need to go on the board docs and click on item 4.01, and then in this case also item 4.02 to see the recommendations that the board approved.
Okay, all right. And then that takes us into action items, and we're actually going to have Dr. Underwood share some of this. I don't know if there's anything you'd like to do to set that up, Dr. Smith, or...
Well, I'll just see how Dr. Underwood does, and
He can do it.
I may find it difficult to not comment on budget since I do love school finance, but we'll see how he does.
All right, let's hear it.
So for this item, we're getting ready to enter in as a negotiation year. Formal bargaining with our Teachers Association begins or can begin September 15th. And so this is a statute that requires, allows people to come in and provide testimony on what they would like to see bargained. And the subjects of bargaining are salaries, wages, and wage-related fringe benefits. So this was an opportunity for the public to share with the Board of Trustees what they would like to see.
Okay, and we did have one individual come up to the podium or to the microphone for this. And I think one thing that's interesting, maybe we should clarify this, because we've talked some, our Chief of Staff, Rick Cameron, has mentioned this. We are finalizing agreements with some of our non-teacher employee groups. So if anyone's wondering, what about the teachers, and I know you're talking about this starting, by law, we can't start that until September 15th,
September
correct?
15th, correct.
So even if you're excited, ready to go, you have to follow that statute. So that's why it takes a little longer to start our negotiations with teachers.
That's correct.
Okay.
I probably should interject. When I heard Dr. Underwood's name, I always associate him with school finance. Didn't mean to skip over the.
Well, you're just looking forward to our budget presentation.
I certainly am.
I understand
but
that.
There are a lot of financial implications, certainly
Absolutely.
when it comes to staff, and I think Carl will point that out when he comes up to his budget presentation.
Okay. All right. So that takes care of that action item, and then information item. We've got one item before we go to you, Dr. Underwood, and Dr. Smith. That was something presented by Stacy Mauser last night.
Yeah, so information item 6.01, consideration to approve the purchase of computer equipment for the Southern Indiana Career and Technical Center programs from SHI International Corporation. These are computers that are more robust than the student computers we typically purchase. So requests for proposals were put out. Those proposals came back in, and then Stacy Mauser, our Chief Technology Officer, indicated then what the recommendation was. That will give the board members 2 weeks now to ask additional questions, should they have those, and for us to respond before the board is asked to approve that in the August 21st board meeting.
Okay. And then that next item then on information, 6.02, was the presentation of the 2024 proposed budget. So, Dr. Underwood, if you want, for those people watching, we'll put this up on the screen. You went through a slide deck with our trustees last night, and if you could, just take us through that. And I know Dr. Smith, as you always would, feel free to chime in and share anything that you'd like to point out as well, because I know a lot of work from you and your team goes into putting this budget together.
Yeah, so last night was the first look for the public to get a gander at our 2024 proposed budget. You know, always start off with a big thank you to the Board of Trustees. As in past, they were able to meet in small groups the few days leading up to this to answer any questions and get a look at. So we definitely thank them for taking the time to do that. Also, a big thank you to Courtney Boliber, who is our Executive Director of Business Affairs. She takes a lot of time, a lot of pride in the work and putting the budget together, and it's a long, arduous process, and she's a recognized leader. So a big thank you to her as well.
Very good, very good. So yeah, let's hear what you shared last.
So in looking at it, when we put the budget together, we have to make some assumptions, and one of those is that the enrollment will remain stable as it was in the prior year. That's the largest factor for our state revenue source, is based upon our money we receive from the state for the number of students we have.
And we're
in the
right
school district.
around 22,000 students.
Right around there. It's been stable for a number of years, but that was one of the assumptions.
Okay.
And then so we start to look at the revenue here, and this is our basic tuition support, which is, again, our largest revenue factor from the state. And there are some factors that go in there, some categorical grants, and so we highlighted and lifted some of those. So our basic tuition support and our complexity grant is our major source of funding, followed by academic performance grant, our special education, career and technical ed, and the non-English speaking grant. And I lifted this last night as a new categorical factor this year. It's money that we will receive for students that speak English as a second language.
Okay.
And these are dollar figures attached to the funding formula, and this is our best guess going into this fiscal year of what our revenue will look like, totaling, when you add it all up, just under $179 million.
And when you say guess, it's not truly a guess. This comes from a formula that is driven by IDOE with certain inputs based upon last year's performance.
Absolutely. We have to make a revenue prediction based upon the number of students that we think we're going to have, and we won't know what that is until we do our September and February counts.
Right.
And yeah, to your point, while it is a very much an educated guess based on enrollment trends and that we follow, but at the end of the day, when we take official enrollment later this fall, it is your number of students that determine your funding from the state, because obviously the more students you have, the state would recognize you're going to need more funds to support that school corporation.
It is, and we will receive money starting July 1st. We've already received money for this year based upon what we estimated to receive, and then the state will true us up in November and December based
Either going up or down based on
up or down at that time. Yes.
Interesting.
So this kind of ties all of our education fund revenue together. You have the basic grant monies, followed by our miscellaneous state and local revenue, which would be for the education fund. It would be transfer tuition, which is money we receive for students that are attending out of district, and summer school reimbursement.
Okay.
Then we start to talk about the expenditures and what can be expended out of the education fund, and it's
First money in, now you're talking money out.
money out. So things that you would that you associate with an education fund, salaries for principals and teachers, as well as supplies and equipment would come out of the education fund. That is highlighted here on this screen. And then a pie chart breakdown. So this kind of lets the board get a look at how we expend the education fund dollars. And we always lift, when you look at it, when you add the salaries and wages and the fringe benefits, it's over 98%, and it's on our people. So the education fund truly goes to support the people that do the work in the EVSC.
And I've heard both of you talk about this before. I mean, truly, we are a people organization. That is absolutely where these funds are going, to support the folks that are getting the work done.
That's right. So then from here we move to the operations fund. The operations fund is funded primarily with our local property taxes, as well as our miscellaneous taxes, our excise taxes, local revenue sources, which would be fee-based programs, our We Care program, daycare program, and then education fund transfers. And I spent a little bit of time with the board explaining why this is necessary. When the state mandated the change to the Education Operations Fund a few years ago, back in 2019, some of the expenses that were housed within the old general fund were transferred or shifted to the Operations Fund without revenue to support those expenditures. So the revenue that we receive in the Education Fund, we are allowed to transfer, as are all of the other school districts in the state of Indiana, by resolution to the Operations Fund, and we do that on a quarterly basis.
Okay.
So, Carl, when you say without revenue to support that, it's not as though the state doesn't provide revenue. They just provide it in the education fund, but they don't allow us to pay for those expenses out of the education fund. So not only are the expenses transferred, then we transfer $22 million, and I've heard you say that we actually transfer about $30 million worth of expense, but we transferred $22 million of revenue out of the education fund into the operations fund.
That's exactly right. Some of the expenses that were transferred out of the old education or general fund to the operations fund were supported by some of those fee-based programs. So it's not necessary to transfer education fund dollars over there in its entirety.
For somebody listening to this, and you did this job before Dr. Underwood at one point in time, Dr. Smith, so obviously both of you very well versed in school finance. How do you, if somebody's listening there, how do they stay on top of this, the changes, the rules, whatnot? You and Courtney and your department, how do you stay abreast of everything?
Well, so a lot of information is passed along through an organization that we are a member of, Indiana Association of School Business Officials. They keep us on top of the changes that happen during the General Assembly and when those changes are made. And you have to be pretty nimble to keep track of all of those. Courtney is fantastic at keeping on track of things and keeping us in good working order.
Okay. Because changes sometimes do result, obviously, from a legislative session.
Happens pretty often.
Okay. All right.
This might be the first year where we haven't had functional or object changes. I think we've had those maybe the last few years, and it tends to come at a time pretty late in the budget process, and that just creates a tremendous amount of work. And those function object numbers are really what the State Board of Accounts uses so that you can do a comparative analysis of like expenditures and revenue sources throughout the state.
The last cycle we had with the General Assembly when going into a budget year, there were lots of changes right before we were putting the budget together, and it was a lot of work to try to get that done. This year it wasn't as bad. We did have some object changes that we had to keep track of, so getting that stuff in order for our financials that go to the state to get that prepared was still a little bit of a task, but not as bad as it was the last go-around.
And then when you look at our budget from a historical basis, you do want to know and be able to track your expenses, your revenue from a decade ago, 2 decades ago. Sometimes when those function objects change, it makes that not impossible, but certainly more difficult.
It's harder to make an apples-to-apples comparison when it's done that way.
Great way to say.
And as we're going through this, I think it's a good point to remind people, because we've talked about this before. Obviously, you and your team have spent an unbelievable amount of time putting together all of these dollar figures. Then eventually our Board of Trustees will be asked to formally approve this, an elected board approving it. But then we've talked before about the process of auditing and State Board of Accounts. You just mentioned them, Dr. Smith. So, I mean, it is constantly a system of checks and balances, wouldn't you say?
It really is. We're audited on a yearly basis because of GAAP accounting, which is generally accepted accounting principles. So we have a team, as many as 10 at one time, looking over our financials. Again, we're very fortunate. Courtney does a fantastic job of keeping our budget and our financial statements in pristine condition. And I think one of the benefits of some of the changes from the General Assembly is it makes it very apparent if the public is looking at it, of what they're looking at. If you want to know what monies or salaries and benefits are spent on teachers, you're going to be able to find it.
Okay. All right. Let's go back to the slide deck then and keep moving through, if you would.
So these are dollar figures attached to our operations fund revenue. Again, property taxes, local property taxes are the main source of revenue here, followed by local revenue sources, which would be fee-based programs, and then there's our education fund transfer that we just mentioned. These are the expenditures permissible in the operations fund, and it's listed as overhead, and it's everything that you would think of, in my mind, of what it would take to operate a school district.
An easy
The business office, salaries for people in the business office and our finance team.
That's
payroll
the thing. They're not classroom teachers, so it's not coming out of the education fund, but they are a vital part of the operations of this corporation.
Bus drivers, a great example as well. So
Custodians.
Okay.
Everything that it takes to operate a school district.
Okay.
Here's a pie chart breakdown of those expenditures. And again, one of the things that we make mention to the board, just to bring to their attention, and I know they're really aware of it, is again, when you add the salaries and wages and fringe benefits of our operations fund, it's over 2/3 are still spent on our employees. So it truly is it's a service organization, and that's where the money is placed.
Okay.
This is to highlight our capital projects plan. We are required by statute to provide a 3-year plan that Steve Scheller and the Office of Facilities put together, and it's just in a kind of a roadmap of if there were unlimited funds, what we would do to keep our buildings in good working order. There's also a provision to pay for technology and the staff that works on technology in the capital projects plan as well.
So for people not familiar, when you think capital projects, think your facilities. I mean, we have 40 schools. We have more facilities and buildings than that. So that's the funds it takes to do what we need to do to keep those in tip-top shape.
Absolutely.
About 5.1 million square feet under roof and about 1,000 acres.
Okay.
Dollar figures associated with the capital projects plan totaling $31 million. Knowing that we won't be able to spend all of that, but this is what the plan would call for our 3-year plan in 2024.
And, we've talked about this before, Dr. Smith. I'm going to give a shout out to Steve Scheller and our facilities department, because anyone who's done home renovations, home building, that things are incredibly expensive, and they take the funds we get and they stretch them absolutely as far and as carefully and with a priority-based need basis as they possibly can to maximize the benefit to our facilities.
Right. That's also why that capital projects budget, why that fund, there's a book that goes along with that based upon an assessment of our facilities. So that's why planning is incredibly important, so that we can maximize our dollars on those things that are absolutely tier 1 priority.
Sure. And sometimes they're not the bright, shiny things that you see. It's not all
Not too
kitchen
glamorous,
renovation.
right.
Sometimes you have to do roofs and things like that. And for us, that could
Roofs,
be parking.
HVAC.
Yes.
We recently have replaced every light bulb in the corporation with an LED program and energy savings programs, upgrading our water to reduce the water that we use, because as we all know, water and sewer prices are going up. So those are also part of our conservation methods that will, as I said, leverage the dollars that we do get for the maximum impact or maximum effect.
Okay. All right.
So moving on from here, we talk about the transportation funds. These are still within our operations fund. And for operating for 2024, our budget is at just over $16 million. Bus replacement, spend a little bit of time here. This is also a plan that we are required to put together. Ryan Williams and Bus Transportation put this together. It's our 5-year replacement plan. And based upon that plan, we would be eligible to replace just under $15 million worth of buses, knowing full well that is not the amount of revenue that we're going to get, but based upon that plan, that's what it would call for.
So I think it's important once again to note we're required to put forward a plan that would show the expense of replacing all of our buses that are 5 years or older,
Yes.
understanding that we will never receive revenue to do that.
But also understanding that we do our bus garage, we do a fantastic job of maintaining, keeping our buses in excellent condition up to all state safety standards to make sure that at all times we have the safest buses on the road that you can have transporting our students.
Correctly.
And these are dollar figures attached. Again, based upon the 5-year plan, this is what we would be eligible to replace, totaling just under $15 million. There's also a provision in there for fair market lease. That's the amount that we are allowed to spend for contract bus drivers as well.
Okay.
This is the Art Institute Fund. We are funding the EVSC Arts Association. This, too, is housed within the Operations Fund. And the Historical Society Fund, also within the Operations Fund. The funding goes to Bossy Field Historical Society. This is our Debt Service Fund, and for 2024, the budget is at $15.7 million. And this next slide would be our referendum debt service, our exempt debt service at $16.3 million. Rainy day fund budget in 2024, we do the practice of including the rainy day fund within our budget cycle to get the authority to spend the monies that we already have. So make sure that the board is aware that the $9.9 million budget that we are asking for there are with monies that we already have in the bank. We're not asking for new funds. These are monies that we already have. We're just asking for the authority to spend as part of our budget process should we need those funds. It's a way of avoiding a 6-week process for asking for an additional appropriation. And this kind of sums it all up. This is one of the last slides that we show the board. On the one column on the left, the advertised budget is what we're advertising. this year. On the right column is our anticipated funding, and this just goes to illustrate some of the points that we've made along the way. The capital projects fund, where our advertised budget is a lot higher than what we anticipate in receiving, as are the bus replacement fund. The advertised budget's at $14.7 million, knowing we're going to receive much less than that. We anticipate just over $3 million for that, and then the rainy day fund, like I mentioned. We're advertising the $9 million budget, knowing that we are not going to receive funding. We already have the funding there.
But boy, when you look at that anticipated funding and that total column, you're talking a budget of almost $283 million. That's no small amount of money for it. I mean, that just shows the size, the scope of the EVSC and what it takes to run the school corporation.
Major corporation.
And this is our next step. So tell us what we can expect moving forward in the process.
Sure. So the budget overview was last night. Return at the next board meeting and ask for permission to advertise. We will be required to post our CPF, our bus replacement, and our budgets on our website. And then we will also post those once the permission is granted to Gateway, which is the state website as well. Followed by a public hearing where people from the community can come and provide testimony, and then pulling it all together in September to ask for adoption of the budget.
Okay, all right, which will wrap up a lot of work. If you've been listening to this and following along, if you go on to Board Docs, you can actually click on this budget presentation and you can see these slides. But any final thoughts about the budget you want to throw out there, Dr. Smith?
Just a few things, because it is very complicated. And if we could go back to the budget, the second to the last slide, because it is a complicated beast. It truly is. But I think we can maybe break it down into some simpler things. So what Carl was talking about when we look at budget, those are our expected expenses. Okay, so that's one component. Similar to your household budget, you're going to have expenses. Then when we talk about revenue, that would be your income. When he specifically talked about rainy day fund, think of that as your savings account, okay? You have the money in the savings account, but in our case, as a public school corporation, we don't have the authority to spend that money until we get what is called an appropriation. So then after we have board approval, then we submit that to the Department of Local Government Finance, and then they will review our budget and approve it for that amount or change it. Then they will look at revenue streams and approve that or adjust that. And then based upon those things, they will give us an appropriation level that will be our permission to spend money as long as we have the cash to back that up. I hope that makes sense. But just like your household budget, you've got expenses, you've got some income, and in our case, and maybe like in my household, I need somebody else's permission to spend the money.
No, I think that's a good analogy.
I think I'll just leave it at that because I do want to go home tonight. But we really operate in the same way. And one other comment that I hear from time to time, well, why don't you have your department chairs go in front of your board and make their case as to why they need a certain budget level? We see that with city government. We see that with county government. So I just want to take this time to draw the tremendous distinction that there is there.
Because it's very different.
It is very different. So in city government, you have the mayor that proposes the budget and the city council then that approves the budget. Well, those are political subdivisions. In the school corporation, you have 7 board members that are elected by the public, and they have the responsibility for governance. One of their tasks is to then employ the superintendent, which then my responsibility is to make certain that we have a staff that carries out the wishes of the board. So unlike city or county government, where you have one body of politic proposing a budget and then another body approving that budget, in a school corporation, you have individuals that work on behalf of the board submitting a budget aligned to the board's priorities. So there should not be a reason for someone to come in front of the board and say, I need more money for this, that, or whatever. Carl and his crew have developed a budget that aligns with the priorities of the board. We are simply presenting the budget on behalf of the board to make certain that they do approve of everything that we put out. But I just want to make certain that
No, I think that helps because it you can see why somebody in the public who's not really aware of this might get confused and think, well, this is a governmental agency, and in the part of the fact that you have elected board members, but it still operates very differently than city and county government or state
Now,
government for that.
the analogy I could use in other states where you have the superintendent that is perhaps appointed by the mayor or elected along with board members, then that would probably be a different budget presentation, a different scenario. But I'm not elected by the public. I am appointed by the 7 members of the school board who are elected by the public. So we submit a budget to our employers based upon their desire that they have for the school corporation.
Which again is why you always thank them for their leadership, because I
Absolutely.
mean, this is certainly one of their primary tasks, obviously.
And it is not something that is just accomplished through this board presentation. This is the culmination of actually years worth of work.
Really, it almost starts over each year, doesn't it?
does.
I mean, you don't wait
Right.
and then 8 months from now sit down one day and start this. I mean, it's almost a never-ending process.
We're finishing the budget for 2023. We're putting together the budget for 2024 and preparing for the budget of 2025.
But from your superintendent's chair, Dr. Smith, I mean, you certainly want a living budget that reflects everything going on to make sure that we have the type of school corporation that our community deserves and expects.
Absolutely. Well said.
Well, thank you, Dr. Underwood. First of all, thank you for all your work on this, you and your team, and thanks for going through this with us today. Very much appreciated.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
And Dr. Smith, that takes us to continued business from last night, and I think you too lifted up just what a great start to the school year it was yesterday.
You know, I did. I think I also questioned the wisdom of having a board meeting on the first day of school, but
Made for a nice long day, but
but we knew that that's what was going to happen.
Right.
But once again, had a great start to the school year, and I just have a great feeling about this entire school year. Looking forward to it. It will be a phenomenal year for EVSC.
And boy, thanks to our parents for having their students ready for us, and thanks to all our employees out in the buildings and behind the scenes as well. So that wraps up this Board Recap podcast. Appreciate you taking the time with us again.
My pleasure.